Crawling toward water, with a broken spine, a Lakota chief lifted her and gave her hands that healed. The arrow was mine, not the one that made the sound that one had already passed. This was the second arrow, the one that doesn't whistle, because it is moving slower, tumbling a little, and it went into the side of the roan gelding I'd ridden for 11 years, and the horse went down like a wall falls, not gradual, all at once. I was thrown clear. Hit the creek bank face first. Lay there with mud in my mouth, and the cold water running over my left hand, and the horse making a sound I do not want to describe. That was late October. The cottonwoods had already turned. A few leaves still hung on, yellow-brown and thin as old skin, shaking in the wind off the plain. I remember looking up at them from where I lay and thinking, I have been shot at by better men than these. The men who ambushed us that morning were 3 in number. Hired. By the look of them, they had the loose, careless movement of men who kill for wages instead of cause. They came from the cedar breaks east of Elk Creek, and they had been waiting since before the sun was up. I was not the target. I understood that even lying face down in the mud, the roan was shot to stop me. I was stopped. Now they would proceed to what they'd come to do. I got to my knees. The 3 of them were already past me, moving downstream along the bank, rifles up, picking their way through the willow roots. Ahead of them, maybe 30 yards, a figure was crawling. A woman. She was crawling toward the water the way an animal crawls when it cannot stand, elbows pulling, one knee dragging, the other leg not moving at all. She had reached the shallows. Her hands were in the creek. She lowered her face to drink, and I saw that her hair was light yellow-brown, almost the color of those last cottonwood leaves, and it was loose and tangled and had creek mud in it and something darker. I did not know her. I had never seen her before, but I have been a chief of the Oglala since I was 32 years old. I have sat in council with men who were dying, and men who wanted others to die, and men who were too tired to be either. I know what it looks like when someone has been left for dead and is not quite dead yet. I know what it looks like when the world has used a person up and thrown them away. I knew what it looked like because I had watched it happen to my own people. She was 20 yards from me. The 3 were 15 yards from her and closing. My rifle was under the roan. You make your calculations fast or you don't make them at all. I got up and ran. I want to say I was silent. I was not silent. I was 49 years old, and I had broken my left collarbone twice, and my right knee once, and the creek bank was slick with October mud. And I came up behind those 3 men, crashing through the willows like a bull, elk, and making about as much noise. The one on the outside heard me. He had fast hands, and he swung the rifle around, and I hit him with my shoulder before it came level, and we both went into the creek. Cold. Deep enough to drop us both. I had the knife, but I lost it when we hit the water, and we wrestled in the shallows, both of us trying to find our feet. He was strong. Younger than me. He got a hand on my throat, and I broke it loose by going under. Instead of pulling away, I went down, got below him, came up behind, and when I got my arm around his neck, I did not let go until he stopped. I came up gasping. The creek was maybe 18 inches deep there. The other 2 were yelling. One of them fired and it went through the willows to my left wide. They couldn't see clearly the willows, the moving water, the angle. I dragged myself onto the bank. The woman was still in the shallows. She had stopped moving. She was watching me, just watching. Eyes, very still. Brown eyes, dark brown. The kind that don't show panic even when panic would be reasonable. The 2 remaining men were spreading out to flank the willows. I had maybe 40 seconds. I went to her. Knelt down. I will say what I said to her in English, though I said it in Lakota first. I am going to pick you up. Do not fight me. She did not fight me. She weighed almost nothing. That was the first thing I understood. Not light in the way a small person is light, but light the way a person is light when they have not eaten in some time. I got her over my shoulder and I moved into the willows and downstream, fast as I could move with her weight and the mud and the sound of those men behind me calling to each other. They searched for 2 hours. I know because I counted. I lay in the willows with the woman across my lap and my hand over her mouth. Not hard, just present, just a reminder. And she did not make a sound. She was breathing, but the breathing was shallow, and I could feel something wrong in the way she moved, even small movements, even just breathing. Something in her lower back or hip was catching, hitching, sending a jolt through her whole body that she absorbed without sound. The men gave up before noon. I heard them mount and ride east. I sat in the willows for another hour anyway. Her name, she told me, when I finally let her speak, was Nora Voss. She told me this in a very even voice, lying on her back in the grass where I'd carried her out of the willows, looking up at the sky. She said it the way a person says their name when they are not sure how much longer they will have it. I asked her what happened. She said, "Those 3 men worked for a man named Aldous Crane, who owned a great deal of the land north of the White River and wanted to own more. She had been the wife of a homesteader named Voss. Had been. Voss had 160 acres at the edge of what Crane wanted, and Voss had refused to sell. And one morning, 4 days ago, Crane's men had come to the homestead. She stopped there for a while. I did not push her. A man who pushes a woman to speak about the worst thing that happened to her is not a man I want to be." She said, Voss was dead. The 3 men had put her in a root cellar and locked it. She didn't know why they hadn't just killed her. Maybe Crane didn't want a woman's death on his hands. Maybe they figured she'd die in the cellar and that would be convenient enough. She'd gotten out through a gap in the timber floor, low enough for a thin woman to pull herself under, and she'd gone into the creek to cover her scent, and she'd been moving since before dawn. Her spine, she said. Something in her lower back. She'd heard it coming through the floor gap. She didn't know how bad. She could feel her legs, but they weren't working right. Not fully. She said all of this very carefully and very plainly, like she was giving me information she thought I might need. Not asking for anything. Not weeping. Not pleading. I sat beside her and I looked out at the plain. I said, "You are going to need a travois." She said, "Yes." I said, "I am going to need to go back for my saddle." She said, "I'll be here." There was a dryness to the way she said it. Not bitter. Just dry. I looked at her and she was looking at the sky, and there was the smallest thing at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the family of a smile. I thought, this one is going to live. The roan was dead by the time I got back to him. He was a good horse. I will not say more about that. I took the saddle and the bedroll and the rifle from under him. The rifle was muddy but not bent. I found the mud-caked knife in the shallows. I dragged what I could back to where Nora Voss lay in the grass. She had not moved. She was watching a hawk circle. She did not look at me when I came back. She said, "That took 11 minutes." I said, "I was thorough." She said, "The saddle." I said, "Yes." She said, "That's yours to carry." I said, "I've carried worse." She didn't say anything to that. But when I glanced at her, that thing was back at the corner of her mouth. I built a travois out of 2 willow poles and the saddle blanket. It was not elegant work. I had to drag it. I had no horse. I pulled it by the saddle straps and Nora Voss lay on it, and she did not complain about the ground or the jostling or the pace. We moved southwest because southwest was away from the land Crane's men had been riding, and because 6 miles southwest, up along a long dry creek bed that most white men didn't know about, was a winter camp of my people. It took the rest of the day. We stopped twice. At the second stop she asked me my name, and I told her, "Lakota kills running bear," which is what I am called among my own people, and that the Americans mostly called me Tom Kills Bear because they found the full name awkward. She said, "Lakota, not Tom. Not Mr. Kills Bear." She said it the right way on the first try. The first syllable, short and flat. She said, "Is it far?" I said, "No." This was, I will admit, a generous estimate. We arrived after dark. My daughter Wea was the first one out of the lodge. She is 23 years old, and she takes after her mother in both temperament and the specific look she gives me when I have done something that requires explanation. She gave me that look now. Then she looked at the woman on the travois. Then she called for her aunt, who is a healer and is named Kappa, which means beaver, though she has not always appreciated that name. Kappa came out already knowing something. Healers are like that. She pushed past me and knelt beside Nora Voss, and began moving her hands along the woman's back and hips and down each leg, pressing, asking questions I couldn't always follow because Kappa's English is sparser than mine. Wea stood beside me. She said in Lakota, "Whose roan tracks are those you've dragged through camp?" I said, "He fell." She said, "Shot?" I said, "Yes." She looked at the woman on the travois. She said, "All right." Wea knew. She is my daughter. She has known me since she was born. She knew this was not just a woman I'd found. She knew it the same way she knew when I was troubled in council, or when a winter was going to be harder than I was saying. She let it go. That is also like her mother. Kappa said the spine was not broken. This was the main thing. The lower back sacrum, she called it, pointing, using the word she had learned somewhere. Probably from the mission doctor at the agency, the sacrum was damaged. Strained very severely. Maybe something cracked, maybe not. She could not be certain. But the legs worked. The feeling was there. The damage was real, but it was the kind that heals. Nora Voss was listening to all of this. She asked Kappa, "How long?" Kappa held up 3 fingers, then pointed at the ground and made a rising, pointing up gesture. I understood it. 3 moon cycles at least. Longer to be right again. Maybe not all the way back. Kappa was honest that way. She didn't give comfort that wasn't true. Nora Voss closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Then she opened them and looked up at the smoke hole of the lodge, and she said, "All right. I want to say that the next weeks were simple. They were not. Crane's men came to our camp twice in that first month. Not to fight, to talk. They came with their hats off and their hands visible, which meant someone had coached them, and they said they were looking for a white woman who was missing and who was the widow of a homesteader and who might be in some distress of mind due to grief. And if she had wandered to our camp, it would be a kindness to return her, so that she might be properly cared for by her own kind. I listened to both of these visits with the same face. That face has taken 49 years to build. It does not tell you what I am thinking. I said the same thing both times. I had not seen a white woman. They looked past me into the camp. I did not move aside. A man who moves aside is a man who is uncertain. I was not uncertain. After the second visit, my cousin Chayton came to me and said, "This is trouble you are choosing, brother. You know what trouble costs us." He was right. The agency was on thin ice that winter. There were men in Washington who were looking for reasons to reduce our land, or restrict our movements, or bring the soldiers in closer. Hiding a white woman from a powerful rancher was not what the agent wanted to see from us. I said, "I know." Chayton said, "Then why?" I said, "Because they tried to kill her." He looked at me a long time. He is 3 years older than me, and he has a scar above his left eyebrow from a crow lance, and he has been in enough trouble himself to recognize it in others. He said, "She is in your lodge?" I said, "Kappa's lodge." He said, "Lakota." I said, "She needs to be still, or she won't heal." He said, "Lakota." I said, "I know." He walked away. He came back 2 days later and said he'd moved 2 families closer to our eastern edge, so we had more eyes on the creek approach. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. She healed. Not fast. Not in a straight line. There were days in November when the pain was bad enough that Kappa had to work on her for an hour, hands and heat, and certain leaves steeped in water, before she could sit up. There were days she could move quite well, and days she could barely move at all. And the sequence didn't always make sense. Didn't follow any clear direction up or down. She learned to take the bad days without turning them into something larger than they were. I noticed that. I noticed it because it's hard to do. I came to Kappa's lodge most evenings. Not every evening. Enough. I would sit outside the lodge door, which is to say, near the edge of the teepee, where I could see in, if the flap was open. And sometimes, Nora Voss was awake. And sometimes she was asleep. And when she was awake, we would sometimes talk. I learned things. She had been a schoolteacher before she was a wife. She had come west from Ohio 7 years before to teach at the Milburn Settlement School, and she had taught there for 2 years, and then she met Josiah Voss, who had 160 acres of hope and a practical nature, and brown eyes she liked. She had stopped teaching. She had not stopped reading. She had 3 books with her when she'd escaped the root cellar. 3 books. She'd gone back into the homestead to get them, which had cost her 40 minutes and nearly her freedom. And she did not seem to think this needed explaining. I asked her what the books were. She said, Plutarch, Gray's Anatomy, and a novel by a woman named Eliot that she had already read 4 times and intended to read 4 more. I knew Plutarch. The agency school had a copy. The Gray's Anatomy. I did not know. I asked about it. She told me. This was the first of many evenings talking about the body. She had, it turned out, been trying to learn medicine for 2 years, borrowing books from the circuit doctor, when he came through Milburn, writing letters to a woman in street, Louis, who ran a small dispensary, reading whatever she could find. Josiah had encouraged it. He was a practical man. The nearest doctor was 40 miles. She had delivered 2 babies and set 1 broken arm and treated a case of blood poisoning that probably would have killed the man without her. Kappa listened to this with narrowed eyes. At first, she had her own knowledge, and she had not given it to outsiders. But she was pragmatic and curious in equal measure. And when Nora began to ask her questions, real questions, specific and careful, not the sentimental interest of a woman who thinks healing is simply being gentle, Kappa began to answer them. Then she began to ask her own. By December, they were talking to each other through me. Since my English was better than Kappa's and my Lakota was better than Nora's, and sometimes I would be sitting between them, translating something about how Kappa prepared a poultice of elk sinew and river clay for deep bruising, and Nora would be repeating the words back in Lakota to make sure she had them. And Kappa would correct her pronunciation and look faintly pleased. I watched this and felt something I did not immediately have a name for. The snow came in earnest in December, and Crane's men stopped coming. I do not know if it was because they gave up on Nora Voss, or because the passes filled in and travel became difficult, or because someone told Crane that his hired men had already attracted attention and that the death of a homesteader's wife would be harder to explain than a missing one. All 3. Maybe. I did not trust the silence, but I worked within it. She was walking by the middle of December, not well, with a long stick and a caution in her movement that would have looked careful to a stranger, but that I recognized as the specific caution of a body testing its own limits, learning where they were today, adjusting. She began helping Kappa. This was not my doing. One morning she simply appeared in Kappa's workspace, the teepee corner, where Kappa kept her materials, her bundles and jars, and drying herbs hung from the poles, and she sat down and asked what she could do. Kappa handed her something without looking up. Nora began doing it. They worked in silence for an hour. After that, it was ordinary. She was good at it. That sounds simple, but it is not simple. Good at medicine is not about caring or about gentleness, though both matter. It is about the quality of attention, the willingness to watch very carefully, and to set aside what you expected to see and report what is actually there. She had that quality. I had seen it the first day, lying in the grass after I pulled her out of the creek. She'd watched that hawk circling with the same careful, uncommitted attention she would later bring to watching the color change in a sick child's gums. She did not romanticize what Kappa knew. She took it seriously. That was rarer than it sounds. White doctors, when they came through the agency and looked at what the healers did, they looked with a kind of polite tolerance that was almost contempt. They had their schools and their textbooks. They knew what knowledge was and what it wasn't. She was different. She brought her anatomy and her Plutarch and her Ohio school teacher's training, and she also brought a genuine, open-handed willingness to say, "Show me what I don't know." Kappa said to me one evening in Lakota, low, like she was confessing something, "This one learns fast." I said, "Yes." Kappa looked at me in that way she has. "She is my mother's sister. She has known me since I was born." She said, still in Lakota, "You are here every evening." I said, "I am concerned about trouble with Crane." Kappa said, She turned back to her work. I could see the corner of her mouth from where I sat. It was, I noticed, the same family of expression as Nora Voss's. January was hard. The winter was harder that year than it had been in some time, and we had lost a bull elk to a shoulder wound in November that had slowed the hunt, and some families were leaner than I wanted them to be. I am a chief. The hunger is not mine first. I make sure of that. But I felt it as all the other things a man feels when the people he is responsible for are cold and hungry, the sharpness behind the eyes, the list in his head that does not stop. I was coming back one afternoon from a cold and unsuccessful elk hunt, a full day's riding producing nothing, and I was leading my second horse, an older gray who needed easy miles. My mood was what it was. I did not try to make it something else. Nora Voss was at the edge of camp. She was standing, fully standing, stick put aside, both hands free, and she was watching the gray horse. When I came even with her, she did not say anything about the empty hands, no meat, nothing brought back. She looked at the gray's left rear leg. She said, "He's been favoring that for a week." I said, "I know." She said, "You want me to look at it?" I said, "You know horses." She said, "Some." I stood there. I was tired. I was 49 years old, and the hunt had been empty, and the winter was long, and I had a gray horse, going lame and 300 people to keep warm, and a dead man's widow in my camp, who Crane's men would kill if they found her. She came and knelt beside the gray's leg. I held the horse still. She ran her hands down the hock and the cannon bone, and cupped the fetlock, and lifted the hoof, and looked at the frog. And the gray stood quiet for her in a way that horses sometimes stand quiet for people who have the right manner about them. She said, "Abscess. Just starting. If you can get it drawn out in the next few days, he'll be all right." I said, "Kappa has a poultice." She said, "I know. I'll make it up." She got to her feet. Slow, careful. The stick was a few feet away, and she glanced at it and made a small decision not to get it. She stood without it, carefully balanced. She looked at me, directly, the way she did most things no performing. She said, "The hunt was empty." I said, "Yes." She said, "What do you need?" Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "What can I do to help?" Which is a question a person asks when they want to feel useful. She asked what I needed. Those are different things. I told her. Patience from the camp, and one good elk, and maybe 2 weeks of weather that doesn't get worse. She looked at the plain. Then she looked back at me. She said, "The patience is yours to manage. I can't make elk appear. But I've been watching the weather, and the pressure has been dropping since this morning." I said, "Meaning?" She said, "The cold breaks within 3 days. Josiah taught me to read it not from instruments, just from the feel of the air and the way the clouds sit. He was usually right. She was not offering comfort, she was offering information. There is a difference, and she knew it. I said, 3 days. She said, I think so. She was right. On the 3rd day the cold broke, and on the 5th day Chayton and 2 young hunters came back with a cow elk, and the camp ate well that night. I did not tell her she was right about the weather. I didn't have to. She already knew. She looked at the fires, and she looked at the people eating, and she looked at the gray horse, whose abscess Kappa had drawn out 2 days before, standing easy at the rope line. She didn't look at me, but there was a quality in the way she stood. I know it now. I knew it then, though I was slower then, to name things. It was the look of a person who is where they belong. February. The creek froze hard. My son, Ohitika, came home from the agency school for a week, as he did sometimes, and he was 16 and already as tall as me, and he looked at Nora Voss with the frank curiosity of a 16-year-old, and he asked me, in Lakota, in my lodge, with the candor of a boy who does not yet understand discretion, is she staying? I said, she is healing. He said, her back is better. She's been walking without the stick. I said, I know. He said, Kappa says she's teaching her about bone setting. I said, yes. He looked at me. He is my son, and he is 16, and he already has his mother's eyes. He said, she works hard. I said, yes. He said, she laughs. I said, sometimes. She did. Not often. She was a serious person, and seriousness was her native ground. But now and then, especially with Kappa, especially when they were deep in some medical argument, and Kappa said something blunt in broken English that cut to the center of the thing, and Nora didn't expect it, she would make a sound short, real, more surprise than performance. My daughter Wea had started engineering these moments deliberately because she liked the sound. Ohitika said, I like her. I said, she is easy to like. He looked at me a moment longer than he needed to. Then he let it go. The way the young do when they think they've seen something the old man hasn't noticed yet. They are not always wrong. March. She came to my lodge one evening. This was not usual. I had always gone to Kappa's lodge, and we had talked there, with Kappa sometimes present and sometimes not. She came to my lodge and she knocked on the pole in the way she had been taught, and I said, come, and she came in. She stood inside the door. She was wearing the deerskin dress Wea had given her in December. She stood straight, fully straight, no stick, no careful hitch in her movement. She had healed. Not all the way back to what she was before. Kappa had been honest about that. There would always be some caution in her lower back on cold mornings and in damp weather. But straight. Upright. Her. She said, Kappa says I could travel by April. I said, Kappa is usually right. She said, I need to think about what I do next. I said, yes. She said, the land is still in Crane's name now, or will be when the papers go through. There's no going back to the homestead. I said, no. She said, I have thought about the mission school at the agency. They have said before that they need someone who can do medicine, at least basic medicine, when the doctor doesn't come. I have thought about applying. I said, that would be good work. She said, it would. She looked at me. The fire was low, and the light was orange and unsteady. She said, and I have thought about not going. The lodge was quiet. I said, where would you stay? She said, I thought you might have a view on that. There are conversations a man has in his life where he understands that what happens next is not an accident, is not fate, is not the wind taking him, that he has to make a choice and make it clearly and stand behind it. I have been in a few of those conversations. I know the weight of them. This was one. I said, I am 49 years old. She said, I know. I said, I am a chief of the Oglala in a time when that means less every year. I have responsibilities that do not get easier. There are men in Washington who would use my association with a white woman against my people if they chose to. She said, I know all of this. I said, my wife died 4 years ago. There is no one who will tell you she did not matter. She said, very quietly, I would not say that. I would not want you to stop carrying her. I was quiet for a while. I said, the man who loves you would not be giving you an easy life. She said, I am a woman who escaped a root cellar through a gap in the floor with 3 books and crawled through a creek with a broken spine. I did not come to you looking for easy. The fire shifted. Outside, a horse moved against its rope. I said, I need to speak to Wea. She said, I already did. I said, and? She said it was time someone in this family made a sensible decision. That surprised me into a sound. Not quite a laugh, more the air going out of me. She was watching me with those dark brown eyes, steady, no performance. She had crossed the lodge, and she was standing close. She put her hand against my face, her left hand, the one that had been in the creek that first morning, and she held it there. Not soft, firm. The grip of a woman who has learned to use her hands and knows what she can do with them. She said, Lakota. I put my hand over hers. Kappa performed the ceremony. She is not a holy man. Those responsibilities belonged to others. But the older women have their own traditions, and Kappa observed them. And Wea and Ohidika were there. And Chayton came, though he had not been invited, because that is what Chayton does. Nora Voss spoke the words she'd been taught in Lakota. Her pronunciation was still imperfect. Kappa did not correct her this time. The mission school at the agency hired her in May. She rode out 3 days a week and came home the other 4. By the second month, the doctor at the agency was writing down what she told him instead of the other way around. By the 3rd month, he was asking her to attend cases he wasn't sure about. In June, Crane's man Aldous himself rode out to the camp. He came alone, which was either bravery or calculation, and he sat his horse at the edge of camp and asked to speak to the chief. I came out. Nora came out beside me. He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look a man gives something when he is rearranging his understanding of how it got to be where it is. Then, he looked at me. Then, he looked away, at the plain. He said, I think there may have been some misunderstanding. Last fall. I did not say anything. He said, I am prepared to make certain arrangements regarding the Voss property. I still said nothing. He said, I would consider deeding the land back, if certain arrangements could be made. Regarding the men who were tried in Milburn last winter, I said, those were Nora's decisions to make. He looked at her. She let him look. Then she said, the deed to the land, with clear title, in my name. $1,000 for the improvements, which you will have destroyed, and the names of the men who gave your hands their orders, the names. In writing, signed by you. He looked at his saddle horn. She said, you can think about it. He thought about it for 3 days. Then he came back with papers. She rode back from that meeting alone, which she liked to do. She had her own horse by then, a rough-coated bay the color of creek mud who suited her, and she rode him without particular elegance, but with a steadiness that covered a lot of ground. I was at the corral when she came in. She dismounted and handed me the papers, and I looked at them. Clear title. $1,000, drawn on the Milburn Bank. 3 names. I said, what will you do with the land? She said, sell it. I don't want a homestead. I want a medicine room. She took the papers back. She brushed the bay's nose with her knuckles, which he tolerated and even seemed to lean into. She said, without looking at me, Kappa has been talking about a proper place to work. Somewhere, she doesn't have to move every time the camp moves. I said, she would have to live close to town. She said, we all would have to live close to town. She looked at me then, completely direct. I said, Chayton will say something about that. She said, Chayton says something about everything. He still came to the ceremony. I thought about that. She was right. Chayton comes. That is the thing about Chayton. He grumbles every step of the way, and he still comes. She put her hand on my arm, not asking. Just there. I looked at the corral. The gray horse was doing well. His leg had been fine since January. The bay stood by the water trough. The late afternoon light was flat and gold, and the plain was open in every direction. I said, I will talk to Kappa. She said, I already did. I said, of course you did. She squeezed my arm once and went to put her horse up. There is a thing a man carries when the people he is responsible for have been diminished. When the land that was his grandfather's is smaller every year. When the young men at the agency look at the ground when they should be looking at the sky. When he has sat in enough councils to know how the calculations go and what is being calculated against, and there is not always enough he can do about it. I still carry that. I won't pretend otherwise. Some weights you don't put down. But there are other things. I carry my son Ohitika, who at 17 was already being asked to help interpret at the agency, and who did it with a dignity that made me proud in a way I don't have clean words for. I carry my daughter Wia, who had her mother's eyes and her mother's temperament, and who managed me with a firm gentleness that her mother would have recognized. I carry Chayton, who shows up to everything he says he won't attend. And I carry the morning, in early September of that second year, when the first medicine room was ready, a real room, not a corner of a teepee. A room with a proper door and a window facing east and a long table Ohitika and I had built from pine. And shelves Wia had insisted on because you cannot find anything in a heap. Kappa came into that room and moved slowly around it and touched everything. She touched the shelves. She touched the table. She touched the window frame. She stood in the center and looked at the ceiling, which was solid real timber and shingle, not canvas, and her face had something on it I had only seen a few times in my life. Nora came in behind her. She stood at the door. She looked at Kappa. Kappa said, in Lakota, to no one in particular, a healer should have a place. Nora said it back to her in Lakota. The pronunciation was perfect. She had been working on it. Kappa turned and looked at her. A long look. Then she gave a short nod, the nod that means, yes. The nod that means, this is what is. I was in the doorway. I had built half that room with my own hands, and I had the splinters to prove it. I stood there, and I looked at those two women in the room they would fill with their particular kind of competence and care, the Lakota and the Ohio schoolteacher, the one who had known every plant along the White River since she was a girl, and the one who had read her anatomy until the spine cracked. Nora looked over at me. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look she gave me was the whole thing, the creek and the willows and the long winter, and the room with the pine plank table, and all the years ahead of us that were going to be hard in the ways they were going to be hard and good in the ways they were going to be good. I held her eyes. Outside, the plain was bright with September light. Somewhere behind the building, a horse moved against a fence rail. The door of the room stood open to the morning. That look she gave me. I have been chief of the Oglala for 17 years. I have sat across the fire from men who had the power to diminish my people and have found, in those moments, something in myself that did not diminish. I have buried my wife and carried my children and watched the land change and held the line where I could hold it and moved where I had to move. But that look, her eyes, dark and steady, no performance, full of the full weight of what she meant. That is what I carry too. That most of all.